The ground beneath your feet is 4.5 billion years old, and it has been destroying evidence the entire time, not hiding it, not preserving it somewhere waiting to be found, destroying it, grinding it down, pulling it under, melting it back into the interior of the planet, erasing everything that ever stood on the surface as thoroughly and completely as if it had never existed at all. In 2018, two scientists at NASA published a peer-reviewed paper asking one question. If an industrial civilization had existed on this planet before us, would we even be able to find it? The answer was no. Not probably not. Not unlikely. No. The ocean floor recycles completely every 200 million years. Exposed continental surface from before 10 million years ago is vanishingly rare. And the chemical signatures a civilization would leave behind are, in most cases, identical to natural events we already have explanations for. We have been reading the geological record for over a century. We have never once looked for what it might be hiding. Then came the anomalies. Buried in the rock, in the ice, on hilltops, beneath the ocean, in the oldest stories ever told. A pattern of things that do not quite fit, scattered across 56 million years of Earth history, waiting for someone to ask the right question. Tonight, we will follow that pattern into the deep past, examine the science that makes the question impossible to dismiss, and sit with what may be the most consequential uncertainty in the history of human knowledge. If this kind of science keeps you up at night, please subscribe and leave a like. It makes an enormous difference. The rock is patient. It has been waiting a very long time. And what it may be waiting to tell us changes everything we thought we knew about who came first. Start with the planet itself, not with us, not with our cities or our satellites or our 4,000 years of written history. Start with the thing that was here long before any of that, a churning, shifting, grinding machine that has been actively erasing its own surface since the moment it formed. The Earth is not a museum. That is the first thing you need to understand about everything that follows. A museum preserves, it catalogues, it keeps. The Earth does none of those things. It recycles, it subducts, it melts. It takes whatever sits on its surface, rock, sediment, ocean floor, the compressed remains of entire ecosystems, and it pulls it downward into the mantle, where temperatures exceed 1,000 degrees and pressure turns solid rock into something closer to a slow, viscous fluid. Everything that goes in does not come back out as anything recognizable. It comes back out as new crust, pushed up along mid-ocean ridges, fresh and blank, and carrying no memory of what it replaced. The ocean floor renews itself completely, on average, every 200 million years. Think about what that means. Every piece of rock currently on the floor of the Pacific, the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, all of it will be gone within 200 million years, dragged under at the edges of tectonic plates and dissolved back into the interior of the planet. And every piece of ocean floor that existed 200 million years ago is already gone, already melted, already erased. Continental crust is more stubborn. Some of the oldest rocks on the continents are approaching 4 billion years old, ancient, extraordinary survivors. But exposed continental surface, the kind of surface where civilizations build and live, is a different matter. Material from before the last 2.5 million years is rare. Material from before 10 million years ago is vanishingly scarce. And the further back you go, the spottier the record becomes. Not gaps you can read around, but gaps so large that entire chapters of this planet's surface history have simply ceased to exist. Now run the thought experiment. Our civilization ends tomorrow. Not in a catastrophe, not in a war, just a quiet cessation. Humanity stops. The machines fall silent. Within weeks, the power grids fail. Within months, vegetation begins pulling apart everything we built. Roots cracking concrete, moisture working into steel joints, the patient, relentless pressure of biology reclaiming what we paved over. Within decades, most wooden and steel structures have collapsed. Within a few centuries, what remains above ground is rubble. Within a few thousand years, That rubble is buried under accumulating soil and sediment, invisible from the surface. And then the deeper processes take over. Within 1 million years, rivers have changed course. Coastlines have shifted. Tectonic movement has resurfaced entire regions. The specific locations of our greatest cities are no longer identifiable. The only thing left is a thin chemical anomaly in the rock. Elevated heavy metals, a spike in certain isotopes, the molecular remnants of plastics in marine sediment, a faint trace of radioactivity from the nuclear tests we conducted in the mid-20th century. A whisper, not a shout, a whisper. And here is the part that stays with you. Within 50 million years, even that whisper is largely gone. Subducted, eroded, metamorphosed beyond recognition. The atoms that made up our skyscrapers are dispersed through sedimentary layers, indistinguishable from the geology surrounding them. The record of everything we built, everything we burned, everything we destroyed, reduced to ambiguous chemistry in a rock core that a future geologist might drill up and puzzle over for an afternoon before attributing it to volcanism and moving on. This is not speculation. This is geology. This is what the planet does, has always done, and will continue doing regardless of what lies on its surface. Which means, before you ask any other question about what may or may not have come before us, you have to sit with this one first. If something had been here, would we even know? In 2018, that question was asked formally for the first time. Not in a late-night internet forum, not in a book written for the credulous. In the International Journal of Astrobiology, published by Cambridge University Press, in a peer-reviewed paper written by 2 scientists with no interest in mythology or speculation, only in the rigorous limits of what the geological record can and cannot tell us. Adam Frank had spent his career thinking about planets and the civilizations that might live on them. Gavin Schmidt had spent his career directing climate research at NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies in New York, one of the world's leading centers for understanding how Earth's atmosphere and surface interact over time. These were not outsiders. They were not contrarians. They were mainstream scientists asking a question that, once they had asked it, seemed obvious. And the fact that no one had formally asked it before is itself something worth pausing on. They called it the Silurian hypothesis. The name is borrowed, with a deliberate wink, from a 1970 episode of a British science fiction program, in which a species of intelligent reptilian humanoids called the Silurians is discovered to have inhabited the Earth hundreds of millions of years before humanity. Frank and Schmidt were not claiming that lizard people built cities in the Jurassic. They were not making any historical claim at all. They were asking a methodological one. Here is the question, stated precisely. If an industrial civilization, one that burned fossil fuels, altered its atmosphere, drove species to extinction, and reshaped its planet's chemistry, had existed on Earth millions of years before our own, would our current scientific tools be capable of detecting it? Their answer, after working through the geology carefully, was no. Not probably not unlikely. The answer was that in most plausible scenarios, the evidence would either be gone entirely or would be indistinguishable from natural processes that we already have perfectly reasonable explanations for. Consider what an industrial civilization actually leaves behind. The same things we are leaving right now. A sharp increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide, locked into the carbonate chemistry of the oceans and the carbon isotope ratios of marine sediments. Elevated concentrations of nitrogen and phosphorus from large-scale agriculture, detectable in sedimentary sequences. Traces of synthetic molecules, plastics, industrial chemicals, in marine deposits. A mass extinction event, readable in the fossil record as a sudden, geologically instantaneous disappearance of species. And a negative carbon isotope excursion, a measurable shift in the ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-13, caused by the large-scale combustion of fossil fuels, which carry a specific isotopic signature distinct from carbon cycling through living ecosystems. These are real, measurable signals. The question is whether they survive. A civilization lasting a few thousand years, and ours has lasted, in industrial form, roughly 300, would compress all of those signals into a layer of sediment thinner than a playing card. In many deep-sea core samples, that layer would not even be continuous. It would be interrupted by gaps, distorted by later sedimentation, or missing entirely where the relevant seafloor had since been subducted. On the continents, where preservation conditions are worse, the chances of finding an undisturbed sample of that layer decrease further still. And then there is the problem of interpretation. Even if a future scientist drilled up a core sample containing every one of those signals, the carbon excursion, the extinction horizon, the elevated metals, the most natural and parsimonious explanation would be volcanism. Large volcanic events produce carbon isotope excursions. They drive extinctions. They alter ocean chemistry. We find evidence of volcanic events throughout the geological record and attribute the signals to them routinely, because for 4 billion years of Earth history, volcanism has always been a correct explanation. Here is the paradox that Frank and Schmidt identified and that sits at the heart of everything in this video. The geological record is read by scientists trained, quite rationally, to look for natural explanations. Because for 4 billion years, natural explanations have always been right. There is a systematic bias built into the methodology. Not a conspiracy, not a failure of intelligence, simply the reasonable assumption that the only thing that has ever happened on this planet is natural processes. The possibility of an industrial civilization is not a lens that gets applied to the data. It never has been. No one has ever drilled a core sample and asked, could this carbon anomaly be the exhaust of something that thought? Frank and Schmidt asked it, and the answer they arrived at was that we would not be able to tell. There is one more detail from their paper that does not get discussed enough. They pointed out that the detectability of a prior civilization is inversely related to how well it managed its planet. A civilization that developed cleanly, that found ways to generate energy without burning through its geological carbon reserves, that maintained its biosphere rather than degrading it, would leave almost no trace in the geological record. It would be essentially invisible to us. The only prior civilizations we could ever hope to detect are the ones that failed in the same way we are currently failing. The ones that burned, consumed, and altered on a scale large enough to leave a chemical scar. The better they were, the less we would know they existed. That thought is worth carrying with you as we go deeper. Because what follows is not a collection of fringe claims or comfortable mysteries. It is a serious examination of what the geological and archaeological record actually contains, and what it might mean that certain things within it do not fit as neatly as the standard story requires. The planet is old, the record is incomplete, and somewhere in the gap between what we can prove and what we can rule out, a question has been sitting, unanswered, for longer than anyone has been willing to admit. To understand why that question matters as much as it does, you need to feel the scale of the canvas it is painted on. 4.5 billion years. That is the age of this planet. Written as a number, it looks like this: 4,500 million years. And the difficulty is that the human mind is not built to feel numbers that large. You hear it, you acknowledge it, and then you move on without truly sitting inside it. Because sitting inside it is uncomfortable in a way that is hard to explain until you try. Here is one way to try. Compress the entire history of the Earth into a single calendar year. January the 1st is the formation of the planet from the disk of gas and dust surrounding a young star. December the 31st, at the stroke of midnight, is right now, this moment, you listening to this. On that scale, the first bacterial life appears in March. The first complex cells, cells with a nucleus, the kind that eventually gave rise to everything you have ever seen, appear in July. The first animals with eyes and limbs and recognizable body plans do not appear until mid-November. The dinosaurs arrive on the 27th of December and are gone by the 30th. All of recorded human history, every empire, every invention, every city, every war, every word ever written, occupies the final 18 seconds of December the 31st, 18 seconds out of a year. And yet we speak, without much reflection, as if intelligence on this planet is something that appeared once, recently, improbably, a singular event at the very end of a very long story, as if the preceding 4.5 billion years were simply a waiting room. Here is the question worth asking instead. What do you do with 500 million years of complex animal life? What happens in 200 million years of mammals? What does a planet produce in the way of mind and capability across timescales so vast that the entirety of human civilization would be invisible within them? The dinosaurs ruled for 165 million years. Think about that, not as a number, but as a duration. We have existed as a species for roughly 300,000 years. The dinosaurs had 550 times that long. They were not the lumbering, uniform, reptilian creatures of older imagination. They were diverse beyond easy description, some running on 2 legs, some on 4, some taking to the air, some reaching sizes that had never existed before and have not existed since. Some hunted in coordinated groups, some raised their young. Brain-to-body ratios varied enormously across the lineage, and some theropod species, the group that includes the ancestors of modern birds, showed neurological complexity that researchers now take seriously as a precursor to more sophisticated cognition. 165 million years. We do not know what that amount of time produces. We have never seen it before. We have no template for it. What we do know is that intelligence, once it appears, tends to develop quickly in geological terms, and 300,000 years was enough for us to go from stone tools to spacecraft. What could a lineage with 550 times that span have produced? The honest answer is that we do not know. And the uncomfortable implication is that our confidence in that answer rests on the absence of evidence rather than its presence. But the dinosaurs are not the sharpest version of this argument. The sharpest version comes from something much closer to us, something that shared our world, our genus, our approximate moment in time, and that we knew nothing about until a single fragment of bone was pulled from the floor of a cave in Siberia in 2010. The cave is called Denisova, in the Altai Mountains of southern Russia. A team led by Svante Pääbo at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology was working on ancient DNA recovery from fragmentary hominin remains. They extracted genetic material from a finger bone, a single small piece of a child's little finger, and ran the analysis expecting to find either a Neanderthal or an early modern human. What they found was neither. The genetic signature was distinct from both, a previously unknown lineage of archaic humans that had diverged from the ancestors of Neanderthals several 100,000 years ago and had been living across Asia entirely undetected, leaving no trace in the archaeological record that anyone had recognized until that bone was sequenced. They called them Denisovans. Here is what makes the Denisovans remarkable in the context of everything we are discussing. They were not a marginal or isolated population. Genetic analysis of living humans has since revealed that Denisovan DNA is present in people across Asia and into the Pacific, most prominently in Aboriginal Australians, Papuans, and populations across island Southeast Asia, where Denisovan ancestry can account for up to 5% of the genome. They were widespread. They interbred with Neanderthals. They interbred with our ancestors. They were part of the world in a real and consequential way, and we discovered them from a finger bone, not from cities, not from monuments, not from written language or agricultural traces or any of the categories we use to define civilization, from a fragment of a child's little finger, preserved by cold and luck in a Siberian cave. The implication should make you pause. If an entire human lineage, one that ranged across a continent, that lived for hundreds of thousands of years, that interbred with 2 other human populations, left a physical record so sparse that we found it by accident in 2010, what does that tell us about the limits of what we can detect from the deep past? The Denisovans are not alone. Homo floresiensis, discovered on the Indonesian island of Flores and described formally in 2004, was a separate hominin species that stood approximately 1 meter tall, had a brain roughly 1/3 the volume of ours, and survived until approximately 50,000 years ago. They made stone tools. They hunted. They lived in an island environment that required navigation and adaptation. They were small-brained by our standards, and yet demonstrably capable of the kinds of behavior we associate with intelligence. What the last 2 decades of paleoanthropology and paleogenomics have forced us to acknowledge is that the story of intelligence on this planet is not a single line rising from primitive to sophisticated. It is a crowded, branching, convergent process in which multiple lineages developed cognitive complexity independently, coexisted for long periods, and vanished, leaving traces so faint that we are still discovering them now. Homo sapiens did not emerge into an empty world. We emerged into a world already occupied by minds. That context matters enormously when you try to estimate how unique we are. 74,000 years ago, something happened to our species that we have only recently begun to understand the full weight of. On the island of Sumatra, in what is now Indonesia, a supervolcano erupted. Not the kind of eruption that makes the news and disrupts air travel for a week. Something of an entirely different order. The volcano, which geologists call Toba, expelled an estimated 2,800 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere in a matter of days, the largest volcanic eruption known to have occurred in the last 2 million years, by a considerable margin. To give that scale some meaning, the 1980 Mount St. Helens eruption, which killed 57 people, flattened forests across a wide radius and disrupted air travel across North America, expelled roughly 1 cubic kilometer of material. Toba expelled 2,800 times that. The ash fell across South Asia in a layer meters thick in some places. The sulfur dioxide released into the stratosphere formed a reflective aerosol that blocked incoming sunlight on a global scale. What followed was a volcanic winter. Years, possibly a decade or more, of sharply reduced temperatures, crop failures on a timescale before agriculture existed, widespread collapse of plant communities that the animals of the time depended upon. In the 1990s, a researcher named Stanley Ambrose at the University of Illinois began examining the genetic evidence of what that event may have done to the human population. What he found was striking. The genetic diversity of modern humans is remarkably low, far lower than you would expect from a species of our age and global distribution. Most living mammals show considerably greater genetic variation than we do. That low diversity is a signal of a bottleneck, a period in the past when the population was drastically reduced and subsequent generations descended from a small surviving group. Ambrose proposed that Toba was the cause, that the volcanic winter was catastrophic enough to drive human populations to the edge of extinction, reducing our ancestors perhaps to as few as 10,000 individuals worldwide. Possibly fewer. 10,000 people. To put that in perspective, that is roughly the population of a small English market town. The entire human species, concentrated into a number that small, scattered across a world that had just been plunged into cold, ash, and darkness. The bottleneck hypothesis has been contested. Later, archaeological work in southern India found evidence of stone tool cultures that appeared to survive the Toba event without a clear break in the record, suggesting that in some regions at least, human populations may have been more resilient than the genetic evidence implies. The debate has not been resolved. The true extent of the demographic collapse remains uncertain. But here is what is not uncertain. The mechanism is real. A volcanic eruption of sufficient scale can, in a geologically brief moment, reduce a species to the threshold of extinction. It can interrupt a civilizational trajectory before it ever produces the kind of evidence we would look for. It can compress generations of accumulated knowledge and social complexity into a bottleneck so narrow that almost nothing comes out the other side intact. Think about what Toba means for the question we are asking. Our species existed for at least 226,000 years before the Toba eruption. 226,000 years of Homo sapiens living, learning, developing the cognitive machinery that makes culture possible. And then a volcano nearly ended it. All of it. the accumulated knowledge of 250,000 years, almost erased in a matter of years by the output of a single geological event. We survived. Barely, if the bottleneck hypothesis is correct. And what survived was not a civilization. What survived was enough people to eventually build one, tens of thousands of years later. Now ask the question in the other direction. What if Toba had been slightly larger? What if the eruption had occurred 50,000 years earlier, when our population was smaller and our adaptive toolkit less developed? What if it had struck a society that had already built something, that had developed agriculture, or metallurgy, or written language, or any of the things we associate with civilization, rather than bands of hunter-gatherers whose entire material culture consisted of things that do not fossilize? There would be nothing left, not cities, not monuments, not records. The geological signature of the eruption itself would dominate the stratigraphic layer, and any human chemical trace embedded within it would be attributed, quite reasonably, to the volcano. Toba is not a lost civilization. It is something more important than that. It is a proof of concept. It demonstrates, within the history of our own species, that the mechanism for catastrophic civilizational erasure is real, geologically plausible, and has already been activated at least once on this planet within the last 100,000 years. The rock does not care what it buries, and it does not keep receipts. All of that, the deep time, the branching lineages, the near miss of Toba, sets up the most important piece of geological evidence in this entire story. Because there is a moment in the rock record, a specific, datable, globally legible moment that has been puzzling scientists since they first identified it. A moment when something happened to this planet that the standard explanations have never quite managed to fully account for. It happened 56 million years ago, and it looks disturbingly familiar. You are going to need to understand a little about how geologists read time. When scientists drill core samples from the ocean floor, they extract cylinders of sediment that can stretch back tens of millions of years, layer upon layer of compressed history, each millimeter representing thousands of years of accumulation. Buried within those layers is the chemistry of ancient oceans, the shells of microscopic marine organisms, the dissolved minerals of seawater, and crucially, carbon. Carbon locked into the sediment in the form of carbonate compounds, and carbon that can be measured isotopically, that is, by the ratio of its two stable forms, carbon-12 and carbon-13. That ratio is a fingerprint. Different sources of carbon have different isotopic signatures. Carbon released by volcanic activity carries one signature. Carbon cycling through living ecosystems carries another. And carbon that originated in ancient biological material that was once alive, buried, compressed over millions of years into fossil fuel, carries a distinctly lighter signature with a lower proportion of carbon-13 relative to carbon-12. When geologists look at a negative carbon isotope excursion in the sedimentary record, a sharp drop in the carbon-13 to carbon-12 ratio, they are seeing evidence of a sudden large release of carbon from one of these sources. The shape of the excursion, its depth and duration, tells them roughly how much carbon was released and over what timescale. Now, 56 million years ago, in the sediment record from every ocean basin on Earth, the Atlantic, the Pacific, the Indian, the Arctic, there is a negative carbon isotope excursion. It is not subtle. It is one of the most pronounced anomalies in the last 65 million years of Earth history. It is simultaneous across every core sample from that era. It is global, unambiguous, and it marks the boundary between two geological epochs, the Paleocene and the Eocene. Scientists call what happened at that boundary the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, the PETM for short, and what it represents is a carbon injection into the Earth's atmosphere and oceans so large and so rapid by geological standards that its effects transformed the entire planet within what amounts to an eye blink of deep time. The numbers are staggering. Current estimates suggest that somewhere between 3,000 and 13,000 petagrams of carbon entered the atmosphere during the onset of the PETM. A petagram is 1 billion metric tons. Industrial humanity, since the beginning of the coal age in the 18th century, has released approximately 580 petagrams. The PETM released at minimum 5 times that, and possibly 20 times more. The consequences were proportional. Global average temperatures rose by between 5 and 8 degrees Celsius. That gap, 5 to 8 degrees, sounds modest until you understand what it means at a planetary scale. The current scientific discussion around climate change is focused on preventing a rise of 1.5 to 2 degrees. 5 degrees is a different planet. 8 degrees is almost unrecognizable. The Arctic Ocean, during the PTM, reached temperatures of 23 degrees Celsius, subtropical, warm enough to swim in. Off the coast of what is now West Africa, sea surface temperatures approach 36 degrees, a level at which many marine organisms cannot survive. Deep ocean waters lost much of their dissolved oxygen in a process called anoxia, suffocation in plain terms, and the creatures that lived on the deep sea floor died in enormous numbers. It was the largest deep-sea mass extinction event in the last 93 million years. At the surface, ocean acidification accelerated as dissolved carbon dioxide reacted with seawater, dropping its pH and dissolving the calcium carbonate structures that corals, shellfish, and many species of plankton depend on for survival. Their shells, quite literally, came apart. On land, the picture was equally dramatic. Rainfall patterns shifted. Regions that had been wet turned arid. New species appeared. Old ones vanished. In rock sequences like the Bighorn Basin in Wyoming, where the terrestrial fossil record of this period is particularly detailed, the entire mammalian fauna turned over, old communities replaced by new ones in what appears to have been a geologically very brief interval. And then, over roughly 100,000 to 200,000 years, the Earth recovered. Carbon was drawn back down through geological and biological processes. Temperatures fell, life adapted, the oceans rebalanced, and in the rock, a thin layer of unusual chemistry remained, readable in every core sample drilled from sediments of that age, a permanent scar from whatever had happened. The question is, what caused it? The most widely accepted explanation involves the North Atlantic Igneous Province, a vast region of volcanic activity that formed as Greenland began rifting away from Europe around that time, opening what would eventually become the Northern Atlantic Ocean. Enormous volumes of magma punched upward through the crust, and critically, much of that magma intruded into thick sequences of organic-rich sedimentary rock saturated with ancient carbon. The heat cooked that carbon out of the rock and into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide and methane, on a massive scale and over a geologically brief period. James Zackos at the University of California, Santa Cruz and his colleagues have spent decades building the detailed climate record that reveals the shape of the PETM and the mercury anomalies found in PETM-age sediments. Mercury, being a reliable chemical proxy for large-scale volcanism, provides support for the volcanic trigger hypothesis. But volcanism alone may not be enough. The second mechanism invoked is methane hydrate destabilization. In the deep ocean, methane, a greenhouse gas roughly 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide over short timescales, is trapped in ice-like crystalline structures called hydrates, locked into seafloor sediments under conditions of high pressure and low temperature. If the deep ocean warms even slightly, those hydrates become unstable. They break down. The methane escapes. And because methane is a powerful greenhouse gas, its release causes further warming, which destabilizes more hydrates, which releases more methane. A cascade, a feedback loop that, once triggered, can run faster than the initial cause. This is where the PETM becomes genuinely difficult to explain tidily. The speed of the onset, the rate at which the carbon isotope excursion develops in the rock record, appears faster than volcanism alone, even large-scale volcanism, can fully account for. The methane hydrate cascade offers a mechanism for the overshoot, the way the warming seems to exceed what the initial volcanic pulse would produce. But triggering that cascade requires a pre-existing warming event. Something had to warm the deep ocean first. Orbital forcing has been proposed as the initial push. Changes in the shape of Earth's orbit around the Sun, specifically a period of high orbital eccentricity, combined with a particular alignment of the Earth's rotational tilt, would have increased the amount of solar energy reaching certain latitudes. Recent research has suggested that the onset of the PETM coincided with just such an orbital configuration. The orbital forcing provides the spark. The volcanism provides the fuel. The methane hydrates provide the amplification. Most researchers today treat the PETM as a multi-causal event, each of these mechanisms contributing in sequence. And for most of the data, that explanation works. Most, not all. Here is the detail that Frank and Schmidt placed at the center of their argument, and that has sat quietly in the geological literature for years, without attracting the attention it deserves. The carbon isotope signature of the PETM onset, that sharp negative excursion, readable in sediments from every ocean on Earth, is, within the current limits of measurement, indistinguishable from the signature of large-scale fossil fuel combustion. Let that settle. The ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-13 produced by burning coal, oil, and natural gas is not identical to the ratio produced by volcanic carbon release. Volcanic carbon carries a somewhat heavier signature, relatively more carbon-13, than biogenic carbon, which is the carbon that originated in once-living organisms. Fossil fuels are biogenic carbon. Ancient biological material compressed over millions of years retains the lighter isotopic signature of the organisms it came from. When you burn fossil fuels on an industrial scale, you flood the atmosphere with light carbon. The planet's carbon isotope ratio shifts in a specific direction and at a specific rate. And that shift, in direction, in rate, and in rough magnitude, is what we see at the PETM boundary. The volcanic explanation produces a signal that overlaps with this. The methane hydrate explanation also produces an overlapping signal because methane hydrates contain biogenic methane, methane generated by ancient microbial activity, which also carries a light isotopic signature. So all three proposed natural causes produce chemistry that resembles, in the sedimentary record, what large-scale fossil fuel burning would produce. This is not a coincidence or a flaw in the analysis. It is a fundamental property of the carbon cycle. The isotopic fingerprints overlap. They cannot, with current methodology, be cleanly separated when you are looking at a signal 56 million years old. What Frank and Schmidt pointed out is precise and careful. They were not saying the PETM was caused by a prior civilization. They stated explicitly that they consider a prior industrial civilization extremely unlikely. What they were demonstrating is that if such a civilization had existed, if something had burned through its fossil fuel reserves and collapsed 56 million years ago, the geological signal it left would be contained within the PETM record, and we would have no reliable method for detecting it separately. The anomaly does not require a civilization to explain it, but a civilization would produce exactly this anomaly. That is the paradox, not a conspiracy, not a fringe claim, a formally published, peer-reviewed demonstration that our tools for answering the question are not fit for purpose. You can read the rock carefully, precisely, with the best instruments available and the most rigorous methodology in the history of Earth science, and you still cannot rule out what might be inside it. The scar is 56 million years old. It is the deepest, clearest anomaly in the recent geological record. And it is telling us something. We just cannot be certain what. Move forward 56 million years. Leave the deep geological past behind and come forward through the Eocene, the Oligocene, the Miocene, the Pliocene, through the slow cooling of the planet, the spread of grasslands, the rise of the great mammal lineages, the appearance and diversification of the genus Homo, until you arrive at a moment much closer to our own. 12,800 years ago, the last ice age is retreating. The vast glaciers that had covered much of North America and northern Europe for tens of thousands of years are pulling back, their leading edges carving and melting as the planet warms. Sea levels are rising. Coastlines are shifting. lands that had been locked under ice are becoming habitable for the first time in human memory. The future is opening. In North America, a culture of skilled hunters is thriving. They are named after a site near the town of Clovis in New Mexico, where their distinctive stone tools were first formally identified in the 1930s. Points of exceptional craftsmanship, fluted along the base, precisely shaped, symmetrical, deadly. The Clovis people ranged across the continent following the great herds. Across the landscape alongside them lived animals on a scale that no longer exists in the modern world. Mammoths and mastodons, giant ground sloths the size of automobiles, short-faced bears that stood nearly 2 meters at the shoulder, American lions, saber-toothed cats, horses and camels that had evolved on this continent and would eventually disappear from it. The world was full. The ice was retreating. By every indicator available in the geological record, conditions were improving for life in the Northern Hemisphere. And then something happened that erased it. Within what appears to have been the span of a human lifetime, perhaps a few decades, perhaps less, temperatures across the Northern Hemisphere plunged. The warming stopped. In parts of Greenland, average temperatures may have dropped by as much as 15 degrees Celsius within decades. The ice sheets, which had been retreating, began to stabilize, and in some places advance again. A cold period that would last roughly 1,200 years had begun. Scientists call it the Younger Dryas. The name comes from a small Arctic wildflower, Dryas octopetala, whose pollen suddenly reappears in European sediments at this boundary, replacing the pollen of the warmer-loving plants that had been spreading northward as the climate improved. The flower's return was legible in the rock. Winter was coming back. The consequences were not limited to temperature. Across North America, 35 genera of large mammals went extinct. Mammoth, mastodon, giant ground sloth, short-faced bear, American lion, saber-toothed cat, dire wolf, American horse, American camel. Gone. Not gradually, not through slow attrition over millennia, but in a geological instant, clustered at the same stratigraphic boundary as the climate reversal. The Clovis culture vanished from the archaeological record at the same time. Whatever replaced it was different, simpler, less elaborately tooled, as if the knowledge and the accumulated technique that had produced those beautiful fluted points had been broken and could not be fully rebuilt. 3 separate catastrophes, simultaneous, a climate reversal, a mass extinction, a cultural collapse, all at the same geological moment. The conventional explanation for the climate reversal, developed over decades of oceanographic research, centers on fresh water. As the great ice sheets of North America melted, they fed an enormous body of meltwater that had pooled behind the retreating glaciers. A vast glacial lake, now called Lake Agassiz, that at its maximum extent covered an area larger than all the modern Great Lakes combined. The hypothesis, developed in detail by James Teller at the University of Manitoba and others, proposes that at some point this lake drained catastrophically into the North Atlantic Ocean, releasing an enormous pulse of cold, fresh water into the sea. The Atlantic circulation system, sometimes called the thermohaline circulation, an ocean-wide conveyor belt driven by differences in the temperature and saltiness of seawater, is sensitive to exactly this kind of disruption. Cold, fresh water is less dense than warm, salty water and does not sink in the same way. If you flood the North Atlantic with it, the conveyor slows or stops. The warm tropical water that normally flows northward ceases to circulate. Northern Europe and the wider North Atlantic region lose their primary source of warmth. The result is rapid, severe cooling, precisely what the Younger Dryas represents. It is a solid, well-supported model. It explains the climate reversal coherently, but it does not explain the simultaneous extinctions across multiple continents. It does not explain the disappearance of the Clovis people, and it does not explain something that a research team discovered when they began looking very carefully at the sediment layer corresponding to the start of the Younger Dryas. What they found there should not have been there at all. In 2007, Richard Firestone at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory Alan West, James Kennett at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and a team of approximately 20 additional researchers presented their findings to the American Geophysical Union. They had been examining sediment cores and surface deposits at multiple sites across North America, all dating to approximately 12,900 years before the present, the boundary layer marking the onset of the Younger Dryas. At every site, at the same stratigraphic level, they found the same unusual assemblage of materials. Nanodiamonds, microscopic diamonds only a few billionths of a meter in diameter, formed under conditions of extreme heat and pressure, the kind of conditions produced by a cosmic impact. Magnetic microspherules, tiny metallic spheres that form when rock and soil are melted by intense heat and resolidify while airborne, raining back to Earth as glassy droplets. Elevated iridium, a metal rare on the Earth's surface but common in asteroids and comets. Shocked quartz, grains of quartz bearing microscopic fracture patterns that only form under pressures orders of magnitude beyond anything volcanic or tectonic, pressures associated with nuclear detonations or cosmic impacts. Carbon spherules, layers of soot, and evidence of widespread burning across large areas of the continent. All of it, at the same layer, at every site. The team proposed that a large, low-density extraterrestrial object, most likely a fragmented comet, broken into pieces during its final approach, had exploded over or impacted the Laurentide ice sheet, the massive glacier that still covered much of northern North America at that time. The energy released would have been equivalent to thousands of nuclear weapons detonating simultaneously. The thermal pulse alone would have ignited forests across a vast area. The shockwave would have traveled at hypersonic speed across the continent. Dust and soot thrown into the upper atmosphere would have blocked incoming sunlight for months, driving temperatures down rapidly. And the impact on the ice sheet itself would have destabilized it, releasing the meltwater pulse into the Atlantic that shut down the ocean circulation. In a single event, the climate reversal, the extinctions, the burning, the ocean shutdown. One cause, multiple catastrophic effects. By 2014, the evidence base had expanded considerably. Nanodiamonds and impact markers had been documented at more than 50 sites across 3 continents, North America, Europe, and the Middle East, all at the same stratigraphic level. The synchronicity was its own argument. Terrestrial processes, wildfires, fungal blooms, ordinary cosmic dust, do not deposit the same assemblage of materials simultaneously at sites thousands of kilometers apart. And in 2018, a research team led by Kurt Kjær at the Natural History Museum of Denmark announced the discovery of a massive impact structure beneath the Hiawatha Glacier in northwest Greenland. 31 kilometers wide, buried under 930 meters of ice, it was one of the largest impact craters ever found on Earth. Its age was initially estimated to fall within the window of the Younger Dryas. Subsequent dating has raised questions about whether it predates the event by a longer interval, and the debate continues. But its existence proved something that skeptics had used as an argument. A large impact in this part of the world, in this geological neighborhood, is not a theoretical possibility. It is a documented reality. The scientific community's response to the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis was, from the moment of its presentation, intense. Critics raised legitimate objections. There was no obvious impact crater from the proposed event, no Chicxulub-scale hole in the ground corresponding to the boundary layer. The identification of nanodiamonds was challenged, with some researchers arguing that the methods used to detect them were not sufficiently rigorous and that the features identified could be explained by other processes. Mark Boslow at Sandia National Laboratories became the most prominent and rigorous voice of skepticism, arguing in a detailed 2012 review that the impact signatures were not consistently reproducible across independent laboratories, and that the airburst mechanism proposed, a fragmenting comet exploding in the atmosphere rather than striking the surface directly, was physically implausible at the scale required to cause the observed effects. These are not trivial criticisms. Science advances through exactly this kind of pressure, and the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis has had to withstand a great deal of it. The proponents' primary response to the crater objection points to an event that everyone agrees happened in Siberia in 1908. A relatively small extraterrestrial object, estimates suggest it may have been no more than 50 to 80 meters across, exploded in the atmosphere above the Podkamenaya Tunguska River. The airburst flattened approximately 2,000 square kilometers of forest. Every tree within that radius was knocked down, many of them scorched. Witnesses described a column of light brighter than the sun and a shockwave that threw people from their feet hundreds of kilometers away. It left no crater. Scale that mechanism up by orders of magnitude. A fragmented comet, multiple pieces, each larger than the Tunguska object. And you get an event capable of producing exactly the boundary layer markers found across North America and beyond, without leaving a single traditional impact structure. The absence of a crater is not evidence against an airburst. It is precisely what an airburst would produce. The freshwater pulse model and the impact hypothesis are not necessarily mutually exclusive. An impact on the Laurentide ice sheet would have released meltwater into the Atlantic. Both mechanisms could have operated simultaneously, the impact providing the trigger that the conventional model always struggled to identify. The debate has not been resolved. It may not be resolved for years. What can be said with confidence is that the hypothesis has survived sustained critical scrutiny from some of the best-equipped skeptics in the relevant fields, that the evidence base has expanded rather than contracted since 2007, and that a growing number of independent research groups on multiple continents have confirmed the presence of the boundary layer markers. Whether the impact hypothesis is ultimately confirmed or not, something happened at this boundary, something catastrophic, sudden, and civilization scale, something that ended the megafauna of an entire continent, erased a sophisticated human culture, and reset the trajectory of human history. The question that follows from that, the question this video has been building toward since its first words, is what state human civilization was in when that something arrived. And to begin answering it, you need to travel to a hilltop in southeastern Turkey, where the answer is carved in stone, and where everything you think you know about the beginning of human civilization will have to be revised. In the Gurmush Mountains of southeastern Turkey, 15 kilometers northeast of the ancient city of Şanlıurfa, there is a hill. From a distance it looks like the surrounding landscape, rolling, sun-baked, unremarkable. Farmers have worked the soil around it for generations, occasionally turning up fragments of worked stone with their plows, stacking them along the edges of their fields without much thought, and going back to their crops. In 1963, a joint survey team from Istanbul University and the University of Chicago visited the area. They noted the worked stones. They recorded the site as a medieval cemetery, an understandable conclusion given the surface evidence, and moved on. For the next 31 years, one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in the history of the human species sat in plain sight, misidentified and undisturbed. Then in 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt arrived. Schmidt had been excavating another ancient site in the region and was searching for further sites of similar antiquity. When local people directed him to the hilltop, he looked at the stones the farmers had been stacking along their field boundaries for decades and recognized them immediately. These were not medieval, they were prehistoric, and they were not small. He began excavating the following year. What emerged from the earth over the next 2 decades, and what continues to emerge today, has forced a fundamental revision of what we thought we understood about the origins of human civilization. The site is called Göbekli Tepe. In Turkish, the name means Potbelly Hill. What lies beneath that unremarkable slope is a complex of massive circular enclosures, each one containing enormous T-shaped limestone pillars arranged in carefully planned rings. Some of the pillars stand nearly 5 meters tall. Some weigh up to 20 tons. They were quarried from outcrops of limestone on the surrounding hillsides, shaped into their distinctive form using flint tools, transported to the site, and raised upright, a feat of organization and engineering that implies a level of collective effort and coordination previously unattributed to the people who built this place. The surfaces of the pillars are carved. Foxes, lions, boars, snakes, vultures, scorpions, spiders, ducks, ibises. A menagerie of animals, rendered in relief with a craft and a confidence that is striking even now. Abstract symbols appear alongside them. And on many of the pillars, along their sides, arms have been carved in low relief, running from shoulder height down toward the front of the stone, where hands are carved clasped together. The pillars are not just structural, they are figures. Giant stone people, standing in circles, facing each other in the dark beneath the hill. Radiocarbon analysis of organic material found within the structures places the oldest enclosures at approximately 9,500 years before the Common Era. 11,500 years ago. Let that number settle against what you know about human history. Stonehenge was built approximately 5,000 years ago. The Egyptian pyramids began roughly 4,500 years ago. Every monument, every temple, every permanent structure in the conventional story of human civilization, the entire timeline you were taught, sits more than 6,000 years after Göbekli Tepe. This site predates the oldest known writing. It predates the first cities. It predates pottery. It predates the wheel. It predates every element of what we traditionally define as civilization. And the people who built it were, according to every other line of evidence available, hunter-gatherers. They had no domesticated plants, no domesticated animals, no permanent villages, no metal tools. They shaped 20-ton limestone blocks and raised them into precise circular arrangements, using nothing but flint and rope and human hands. The conventional model of how civilization develops says this is impossible. Not literally impossible. The site exists, which settles that question, but causally inverted. The accepted sequence runs like this. Agriculture produces food surplus. Surplus allows permanent settlement. Permanent settlement enables social specialization. Specialization generates hierarchies. Hierarchies create organized religion. Organized religion generates the desire and the capacity to build monumental architecture. Farm first, then build. That is the sequence every major theory of civilizational development has assumed. Göbekli Tepe reverses it entirely. The monument came first. Long before anyone in the region had cultivated a single crop, people were gathering at this hilltop and building on a scale that implies extraordinary social organization. The desire to construct something sacred and permanent preceded agriculture. According to Klaus Schmidt's own interpretation, it may have driven it. The labor required to build and maintain the site over centuries, drawing workers from a wide surrounding area, created a logistical problem. How do you feed that many people gathering in one place for extended periods? The answer, Schmidt proposed, was cultivation. The need to provision the builders pushed people toward the deliberate growing of wild grains. That proposal found unexpected support in the genetics laboratory. 30 kilometers from Göbekli Tepe, researchers identified the world's oldest known domesticated strains of wheat. Radiocarbon dating places the domestication at approximately 10,500 years ago. 500 years after Göbekli Tepe's construction is thought to have begun. The cradle of agriculture and the world's oldest monumental site are neighbors, and the evidence suggests the temple came first. Computer modeling published in the Cambridge Archaeological Journal added a further layer of strangeness. Analysis of the layout of the three main enclosures revealed that they are connected by an equilateral triangle. The complex was not assembled piecemeal over centuries, but was conceived as a unified geometric design. The builders used ropes to measure distances and establish angles. They worked with mathematical planning of a sophistication that, until this site was excavated, no one had attributed to hunter-gatherer societies. And then, around 8,000 years before the Common Era, after centuries of use, after generations of people had gathered at this place to build and carve and presumably worship, the site was deliberately sealed. Not abandoned. Sealed. The enclosures were filled from above with earth, rubble, and refuse, intentionally, methodically, thoroughly buried. Whoever did this did not leave. The covering was active, not passive. They were not walking away from the site, they were putting it away. Why? The honest answer is that no one knows. Theories range from ritual closure, the symbolic ending of a religious era, the enclosures buried as a form of sacred preservation, to deliberate concealment from enemies or from a new generation with different beliefs. What is certain is that the burial, whatever its intention, is the reason the site survived. 12,000 years of erosion, seismic activity, and weathering that has erased every other structure of comparable age left Göbekli Tepe intact beneath its covering of soil. The burial was, intentionally or not, an act of extraordinary preservation. On one of the most elaborately carved pillars at the site, the one researchers have designated Pillar 43, sometimes called the Vulture Stone, a scene is carved that is unlike anything else found at Göbekli Tepe, or anywhere else from this period. At the top, a vulture spreads its wing over a round object, a sphere, or possibly a head. Below the vulture, a scorpion. Around it, other animals, a crane, smaller birds, abstract symbols. The composition is dense and deliberate, arranged with a care that suggests not decoration but meaning, something specific being communicated in a visual language whose full grammar we have not recovered. In 2017, Martin Sweatman and Dimitrios Tsikritsis at the University of Edinburgh published a systematic analysis of the carvings. Their method was to treat the animal figures as potential star maps, matching each carved animal against the constellations visible from the site's latitude, and asking whether the composition as a whole could be read as a depiction of the night sky at a specific moment in time. Their conclusion was that it could. The scene on Pillar 43, they proposed, depicts the sky above Göbekli Tepe at approximately 10,950 years before the Common Era, the onset of the Younger Dryas, the catastrophic climate reversal we have been following through this video. If that interpretation is correct, the pillar is not decoration. It is a date, carved in stone, encoded in the language of constellations, placed at the entrance to the oldest monumental complex on Earth. This is when the catastrophe happened. Mainstream archaeologists are skeptical. Archaeoastronomy, the attempt to read astronomical meaning into ancient carvings, is a methodology that has been misapplied often enough that the scientific community treats it with caution. Without independent corroboration, the interpretation of Pillar 43 as a star map remains contested, and it should be. But even setting the astronomical claim aside entirely, the timing of Göbekli Tepe is its own kind of statement. The Younger Dryas ended approximately 11,600 years ago. The oldest structures at Göbekli Tepe date to approximately 11,500 years ago. The gap between those two dates is, within the margin of radiocarbon dating, negligible. It is as if the moment the cold released its grip, the moment the catastrophe that had defined the world for 1,200 years finally relented, someone began building, immediately, urgently, with a level of knowledge and skill and organizational sophistication that does not arise from nothing. You do not invent equilateral triangle geometry on the spot. You do not develop the capacity to coordinate the quarrying, transport, and raising of 20-ton stone blocks without a prior tradition to draw on. The knowledge that Göbekli Tepe required had to come from somewhere. The conventional answer is that it developed gradually within the regional hunter-gatherer population during the preceding millennia, a slow accumulation of capability that finally expressed itself in this place. That is possible, and it is the most parsimonious explanation given what the evidence directly shows. But there is another reading, one that Göbekli Tepe does not prove, but that it leaves space for. What if the knowledge did not develop here, slowly, in isolation? What if it was carried here by people who already had it, people who had come through something, people who were building not at the beginning of something, but at the end of something else entirely? The stones do not answer that question, they only ask it. On the Giza Plateau in Egypt, at the edge of the desert, there is a monument so familiar that it has become almost invisible, present in the background of so many images, so embedded in the visual shorthand of ancient history that people stop truly looking at it, which is unfortunate, because if you look at it carefully, with the eyes of a geologist rather than a tourist, it asks a question that Egyptology has been arguing about for more than 30 years and has not yet resolved. The Great Sphinx of Giza is carved from the living bedrock of the plateau, not built from blocks, not assembled from pieces transported from elsewhere. Carved downward from the surface, its body liberated from the surrounding limestone by removing the rock on all sides and leaving the form behind. It faces due east, toward the rising sun, a lion's body with a human head, the largest surviving monumental sculpture from the ancient world. The mainstream Egyptological position attributes the Sphinx to the pharaoh Khafra, who built the second of the three great pyramids at Giza, and whose reign is dated to approximately 2,500 years before the Common Era. The evidence for this attribution is circumstantial but substantial. The Sphinx sits immediately adjacent to Khafra's pyramid complex and his valley temple. Its style is consistent with Old Kingdom artistic conventions, and a damaged granite stele placed between its paws in a later era may reference Khafra's name, though the critical portion of the inscription is badly eroded and the reading is disputed. There is, notably, no inscription on the Sphinx itself identifying its builder. No contemporary record of its construction has ever been found. The attribution to Khafra is an inference, well-reasoned and widely accepted, but an inference nonetheless. In 1990, a geologist arrived at the site and looked at the walls of the Sphinx enclosure, the trench cut into the bedrock of the plateau when the monument's body was freed from the surrounding rock, and saw something that did not fit. His name was Robert Schoch. He held a doctorate in geology and geophysics from Yale and was an associate professor at Boston University. He had been invited to examine the site by John Anthony West, an independent researcher who had long suspected the conventional dating was wrong. Schoch arrived as a skeptic. He expected to look at the enclosure walls, confirm that the weathering was consistent with the known history of the site, and return home. What he saw instead stopped him immediately. The walls of the Sphinx enclosure were covered in deep, rounded vertical grooves, undulating surfaces, wider at the top than at the bottom, running down the face of the rock in channels that curved and dissolved into each other. To a geologist, this profile is immediately recognizable. It is the signature of water erosion, specifically of rainfall, of water sheeting down a vertical surface over an extended period, dissolving limestone from above and carrying it downward, carving those characteristic rounded channels as it goes. Here is the problem. The Giza Plateau is at the edge of the Sahara Desert. It has received negligible rainfall for the past 5,000 years. The dominant weathering agent on the plateau for all of that time has been wind. Wind-driven sand abrading stone surfaces, producing horizontal striations, sharp edges, angular profiles. That is what wind erosion looks like. And there are structures on the Giza Plateau that were unambiguously built during the Old Kingdom. Rock-cut tombs carved from the same limestone formations, at the same period as the conventionally dated Sphinx, that show exactly this kind of wind and sand weathering. Horizontal layering, sharp edges, the signature of a desert environment. The Sphinx enclosure does not look like that. It looks nothing like the other Old Kingdom rock-cut structures a few hundred meters away. If both were carved from the same rock at the same time under the same climate, they should show the same erosion patterns. They do not. Schoch's conclusion was that the Sphinx enclosure had been exposed to a period of sustained, heavy rainfall, and that this rainfall must have occurred before the plateau became the arid environment it has been for the past 5 millennia. The last time the region experienced that kind of sustained precipitation was during a period geologists call the African Humid Period, which ran from approximately 12,000 to 5,000 years before the Common Era. During those millennia, the Sahara was not a desert. It was a green savanna, crossed by rivers and dotted with lakes, capable of supporting large human populations. Rock art found deep in what is now the barren central Sahara. Images of people swimming, of cattle grazing beside waterways, of a landscape utterly unlike the one there today. records this vanished world with a directness that is difficult to dismiss. Schoch went further. Using seismic equipment, sledgehammers struck against steel plates, generating sound waves that penetrated the bedrock and reflected back from subsurface boundaries. He measured the depth of weathering beneath the Sphinx's base. The data showed weathering extending far deeper into the rock than the relatively young age of an Old Kingdom monument would produce. The depth was consistent with prolonged exposure to rainfall from above, not with the localized moisture effects proposed by critics who suggested that periodic flooding of the enclosure by Nile inundation, or moisture absorbed from saturated sand, could explain the erosion profiles without requiring a wetter climate. The Egyptological response was swift and firm. Mark Lehner, one of the foremost authorities on the Giza Plateau, disputed the interpretation directly, arguing that moving the Sphinx's date back by thousands of years on the basis of a single weathering profile was methodologically unsound and created far more problems than it solved. If the Sphinx was built before 5,000 years before the Common Era, who built it? There is no evidence of a civilization in Egypt at that time with the social organization required to produce such a monument. The conventional dating fits the overall architectural logic of the Giza complex. Moving the Sphinx outside that sequence requires explaining not just the weathering, but the entire absence of corroborating evidence for a sophisticated pre-dynastic Egyptian civilization. These are fair objections, seriously made. The geological argument does not exist in isolation. It has to contend with everything we do not find, and what we do not find is any supporting civilizational context for a Sphinx built 7,000 or 8,000 years before the pyramids. But Schoch had one more observation, quieter than the seismic surveys and the erosion profiles, that has remained difficult to explain away. The head of the Sphinx is too small for its body. Not slightly, not within the range of artistic license, measurably, disproportionately small relative to the scale of the monument. And the tool marks on the head are consistent with Old Kingdom craftsmanship, while the body shows a different character of surface treatment entirely. Schoch and others have proposed that the head was recarved, that the original head, whatever it depicted, had been so severely degraded by thousands of years of weathering that by the time of the Old Kingdom, a pharaoh had it reshaped into its current form. A smaller head, carved from a larger eroded original, would explain both the disproportionate scale and the discrepancy in surface treatment. The body endured millennia of rainfall. The head was freshly worked in the desert era and has only known arid conditions since. The debate remains unresolved. The conventional dating is well supported and coherently argued. The geological evidence is real, professionally documented, and has never been fully refuted, only contested. Both things are true simultaneously, which is exactly the kind of situation that makes a question worth holding open. There is a monument in the Egyptian desert that faces the rising sun and that shows on its body the marks of weather it should not have seen. And the question of when those marks were made and by what kind of world has not yet been answered. In 1963, a man in the town of Derinkuyu in central Turkey was renovating his house. He swung a sledgehammer into a basement wall. The stone crumbled. Behind it was not more wall but darkness, a passage leading downward into the rock beneath his feet. He pushed through and followed it. The passage led to a room. The room led to another passage. That passage led to another room, and another, and another, each one lower than the last, the complex descending through the soft volcanic rock of the region in a series of levels that seemed, as he moved through them, to have no bottom. What this man had broken into, by accident, while renovating his home, was an underground city. Derinkuyu extends approximately 85 meters into the earth. 18 levels, carved from the volcanic tuff of the Cappadocian Plateau, containing storage rooms and stables, wine presses and oil presses, kitchens and meeting halls, places that appear to have served as schools, and spaces that were used as chapels. At intervals along the main corridors, massive circular stone doors, each weighing several hundred kilograms, could be rolled across the passage from the inside, sealing the level against anyone attempting entry from above. They could not be opened from outside. They were designed specifically to be operated by people who were already in, holding off people who were trying to get in. The engineering is meticulous in a way that takes a moment to absorb. The ventilation shafts, a network of vertical channels running from the deepest levels to the surface, provided fresh air throughout the complex. Some of these shafts doubled as wells, reaching down to the water table and supplying clean drinking water to every level. The air circulation was designed well enough that even at the lowest inhabited depths, the atmosphere remained breathable. Someone planned this. Not a single shaft and not a single storage room, but an integrated system, a city, in which every element depended on the elements around it functioning correctly. The ventilation system had to be conceived before the first shaft was dug, because you cannot dig the shafts after the rooms around them are already carved. The scale is difficult to hold in mind. Derinkuyu could shelter an estimated 20,000 people, along with their livestock and food supplies, for extended periods. 20,000. The logistical thinking required to provision such a refuge, to design it so that it could sustain a population of that size underground, while the surface was inaccessible, implies an institution, a body of knowledge and planning and social authority, that goes far beyond the practical response to a cavalry raid. And Derinkuyu is not alone. Cappadocia contains more than 200 known underground settlements. Kaymakli, 9 kilometers away, is similarly vast. Historical sources describe a tunnel connecting the two cities, a subterranean passage nearly 9 kilometers long, which, if it exists as described, would make the two complexes a single unified underground network capable of sheltering and moving tens of thousands of people without ever returning to the surface. In 2015, construction workers breaking ground for a housing development near the town of Nevşehir uncovered the entrance to a further underground city. Initial surveys suggested it may extend even deeper than Derinkuyu, covering an area of nearly 500,000 square meters. Less than half of Derinkuyu itself has been fully excavated. What lies in the unsurveyed sections of both complexes, and in the majority of the 200 other known settlements, remains unknown. The conventional archaeological explanation for Derinkuyu and the other Cappadocian cities is straightforward and well documented. The region sat at the crossroads of successive empires for thousands of years. Hittites, Persians, Greeks, Romans, Byzantines, Arabs, Mongols, and Ottomans all crossed, occupied, or contested this territory. The underground cities provided refuge during invasions, and the historical record confirms this use explicitly. Byzantine-era Christian communities sheltered in them during the Arab raids of the 7th through 9th centuries. Later populations used them during the Mongol incursions of the 13th and 14th centuries. The practical value of an underground refuge in a region of chronic military instability is obvious and sufficient as an explanation. The earliest construction of the upper levels is generally attributed to the Phrygians, who inhabited the region approximately 2,800 years ago. The volcanic tuff that makes up the Cappadocian Plateau is soft enough to carve with iron tools and hardens upon exposure to air, making it well suited to underground construction. The Phrygians had the technology and the motivation. The Christian communities that came after them expanded the complexes dramatically, adding the deeper levels and the elaborate defensive features. This explanation is rational, well evidenced, and almost certainly correct for the historical periods it covers, but it does not fully account for the depth. You do not need to go 18 levels underground to shelter from a cavalry raid. A few levels, perhaps 30 or 40 meters, provides adequate protection. You seal the doors, you wait, the army passes. The upper levels of the Cappadocian cities serve that purpose. The lower levels, the deepest chambers, the lowest ventilation shafts, the rooms at 80 meters down, serve a different purpose, for a threat of a different character, a threat from which distance from the surface itself is the protection. What kind of threat requires the surface to be entirely uninhabitable for an extended period? The speculative answers range widely. The volcanic history of the region is real. Cappadocia's extraordinary landscape of cone-shaped rock formations and cave-riddled cliffs was produced by ancient volcanic eruptions, and the tuff that made the underground cities possible is volcanic in origin. A population with intimate knowledge of that volcanic history would understand the danger of sustained ash falls, pyroclastic flows, and the toxic gases that accompany major eruptions. Going deep underground during a volcanic event that makes the surface unbreathable for months is rational. The material that threatened them is the same material they carved their refuge from. Others have noted the proximity of Göbekli Tepe, roughly 600 kilometers to the east, and the shared time frame of the wider region's human history, and have asked whether the deepest levels of the Cappadocian cities could predate the Phrygian upper floors by a considerable margin. There is no direct evidence for this. The archaeological dating of the lower levels has not resolved it. But the question, what were the deepest chambers built for and against what, has not been answered by the conventional model. What the underground cities of Cappadocia represent, at minimum, is a civilizational response to existential threat. Not a family hiding in a cellar. An organized community, provisioned and engineered and designed by people who had thought carefully about how to survive something that made the world above them uninhabitable. That kind of thinking does not arise casually. It arises from experience, or from the memory of experience, from a tradition that said, when the surface fails, you go down. Every culture on Earth tells a story about the end of the world, not a future apocalypse, a past one, a time before memory, or rather, a time at the edge of memory, when the water came and swallowed everything that had been built and everyone who had built it, and a small number of survivors were left to begin again in a world that the flood had remade. The most familiar version in the Western tradition is Noah. But the Noah story is not the oldest version of this narrative. It is not even close. Roughly 3,000 years before the Book of Genesis was written in its current form, a nearly identical story was being told in ancient Sumer, the civilization that arose in what is now southern Iraq and produced the world's first known writing, its first known cities, and what may be its first known literature. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest surviving work of narrative literature in human history, a man named Utnapishtim tells the hero Gilgamesh how he alone was warned by the god Ea of a coming flood. He was instructed to build a great boat, to take aboard the seed of every living thing. The rains came. For 6 days and 7 nights, the storm raged and the waters rose until, Utnapishtim says, even the gods were terrified by what they had unleashed. On the 7th day, the storm abated. The boat came to rest on a mountain. Utnapishtim sent out a dove. It returned. He sent out a swallow. It returned. He sent out a raven. The raven did not return. The waters were receding. The structural parallels to the later Hebrew account are not coincidental. Scholars of the ancient Near East have long recognized that the Genesis flood narrative drew on the older Mesopotamian tradition. An even earlier Mesopotamian text, the Epic of Atrahasis, composed roughly 1700 years before the Common Era, tells a similar story with additional detail. The Eridu Genesis, another Sumerian text, provides yet another version. The flood was not a marginal event in Mesopotamian religious thought. It was foundational, central, the moment that divided the world before from the world after. But the Mesopotamian tradition is not what makes the flood myth remarkable. What makes it remarkable is that it does not belong to Mesopotamia. In Hindu tradition, the god Vishnu warns the sage Manu of an approaching deluge. Manu builds a boat. A giant fish guides him through the rising waters to safety on a high mountain from which he repopulates the world. The story is structurally almost identical to the Mesopotamian account. Divine warning, a vessel, the preservation of life, a mountain refuge, a new beginning. And yet it developed in a completely separate cultural and linguistic tradition, across a geographical distance that makes direct borrowing implausible for the earliest versions. In Greek myth, Zeus decides to destroy humanity with a flood. Deucalion and Pyrrha, the only survivors of Worth, float to safety and repopulate the earth by throwing stones over their shoulders, which become people. In Chinese tradition, the sage Gun and his son Yu grapple with a great flood, and Yu's success in controlling it becomes the founding act of the first Chinese dynasty. Norse cosmology begins with a flood of primordial material. In Mesoamerica, the Aztec described a previous age of the world destroyed by water. The Maya Popol Vuh records an earlier creation swept away by flooding. Across the Amazon basin, across the Pacific Islands, across sub-Saharan Africa, flood narratives recur with a frequency and a structural consistency that defies easy explanation through coincidence. Scholars have catalogued more than 200 distinct flood traditions from cultures with no known contact with one another. The details vary, the gods differ, the geography changes, but the structure is the same. A world destroyed by water, a remnant saved, a new world built from what survived. The conventional explanation is cultural convergence. Floods are a universal human experience. Every civilization built near water, and they all were, because water is survival, has experienced catastrophic flooding. Local disasters become mythologized. The myth grows over generations until it becomes a creation story, an account of origins and endings, a way of framing the world as something that was made and can be unmade. There is merit in this explanation, but it does not account for the specificity. It is not just that every culture has a flood story. It is that so many of them share the same structural elements: the warning, the vessel, the animals, the mountain, the birds, the aftermath. Elements that go far beyond a generic account of water rising and people drowning. That degree of convergence across genuine cultural independence is harder to explain as coincidence the more carefully you look at it. Patrick Nunn at the University of the Sunshine Coast and his colleague Nicholas Reed have spent years studying this question from a specific and unusually rigorous angle. Their work focuses on Aboriginal Australian oral traditions, describing coastal flooding events around the Australian continent. In a study published in 2016, they analysed 21 such traditions in detail, comparing the geographical specifics of each account against the known record of post-glacial sea level rise along the relevant coastline. In every case where the comparison could be made, the oral tradition accurately described a real event, a specific stretch of coast that had been dry land and was subsequently flooded, with the flooding occurring at a time consistent with the geological record. Some of these traditions appear to preserve accurate geographical memory of events that occurred more than 10,000 years ago. 10,000 years, transmitted across more than 400 generations in a pre-literate culture, without writing, without maps, without any of the information technology we rely on, and arriving at the present day still geographically accurate. If that is possible, and Nunn and Reed's evidence suggests strongly that it is, then the global flood tradition takes on a different weight, not as mythology, not as metaphor, as memory, as the accumulated record of real events, passed down through the only medium available to people who had no other way to store it: story, ceremony, the formal obligation of remembrance. Because something real did happen to the coastlines of the world. It happened slowly, by the standard of a human catastrophe, but not slowly by the standard of a human life. Between roughly 15,000 and 7,000 years ago, sea levels rose by approximately 120 meters. Every coastal landscape on Earth was transformed. Land bridges disappeared. Continental shelves drowned. Entire regions that had been habitable for tens of thousands of years were permanently submerged. And in the North Atlantic, approximately 8,200 years ago, it happened suddenly. The Storegga submarine landslide off the coast of Norway generated a tsunami that sent walls of water across the ocean. The final remnants of Doggerland, the vast, rich landscape that had connected Britain to continental Europe, home to human communities for thousands of years, were inundated. The people living there had to leave. Some of them survived to tell their children what had happened, and their children told their children. Perhaps that is what the flood myths are. Not one event, a process. 8,000 years of coastlines drowning, of communities displaced, of everything built at the water's edge disappearing beneath the sea. encoded in the most durable storage medium available to the people who lived through it: the obligation to remember and to tell. In 1929, a German theologian named Gustav Adolf Deissmann was working through the uncatalogued holdings of the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, the former administrative heart of the Ottoman Empire, whose archives contained thousands of maps, manuscripts, and documents that had accumulated over centuries and never been systematically examined. He pulled a rolled piece of animal skin from a shelf, gazelle hide, dried and aged. He unrolled it carefully. What he found was a map fragment, clearly part of a larger chart, roughly 1/3 of what had once been a complete document. It had been drawn and signed in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral and cartographer named Haji Ahmed Muhyiddin Piri, known to history as Piri Reis. He was a seasoned navigator, a former privateer turned naval officer, and a devoted compiler of geographical knowledge. In his own annotations on the map, written in Ottoman Turkish, he explained that he had assembled it from approximately 20 source charts, 8 maps based on the geographical traditions of ancient Greece, several Portuguese charts from contemporary Atlantic explorations, an Arabic map, and one he described as having been drawn by Christopher Columbus himself, a map that has since vanished from history entirely, and whose contents can now only be inferred from what Piri Reis preserved of them. The map depicted the western coast of Africa, the Iberian Peninsula, and the eastern coast of South America, with an accuracy that impressed 20th century cartographers when the fragment was first studied. But what drew the most sustained attention, then and since, is not those coastlines. It is the landmass shown below South America, a large continuous form extending east and south beyond the bottom of the fragment, suggesting a vast territory in the southern reaches of the Atlantic. In 1966, Charles Hapgood, a professor at the University of New Hampshire, published a book called Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings. Hapgood and his students had analysed the Piri Reis map carefully, and his central claim was striking. The southern landmass, he argued, depicted Antarctica, specifically Antarctica without its ice sheet, showing the actual rock coastline that lies buried beneath kilometres of glacial ice, and that was only mapped using modern seismic and satellite technology in the 20th century. The implications, if Hapgood was right, were extraordinary. Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1820, more than 300 years after Piri Reis drew his map. No European navigator, no Ottoman sailor, no known explorer had reached the continent in 1513. If the map showed Antarctica accurately, someone had been there before. Someone had possessed both the navigational capability to reach the southernmost waters of the planet and the cartographic skill to map what they found, and had passed that knowledge forward through a chain of source maps until it arrived, partially preserved, in the hands of an Ottoman admiral compiling his masterwork in Istanbul. Hapgood proposed that an unknown ancient civilization, technologically capable, maritime, and now lost, had circumnavigated and mapped the world in a period before the ice sheet covered Antarctica entirely. He did not invoke supernatural explanations. He invoked lost human knowledge, a civilization erased by time and catastrophe, whose geographical records had survived in fragments through successive copying and recopying across millennia. An earlier work by Hapgood on a related subject of Earth's geological history had received a foreword from Albert Einstein, who found the underlying questions worth serious consideration, though he did not specifically endorse the ancient Sea Kings hypothesis. The mainstream scholarly response to the cartographic claims has been thorough and, on the central point, convincing. Greg McIntosh's exhaustive academic study of the Piri Reis map, published in 2000, examined the fragment in precise detail and concluded that the southern landmass is almost certainly a distorted depiction of the southern coast of South America, not Antarctica. Mapmakers of the early 16th century did not yet know the full extent of South America's southern reaches, and the conventions of the period routinely involved extending coastlines speculatively based on theory and rumour. The shape of the southern landmass on the Piri Reis map, McIntosh argued, is consistent with a compressed and distorted rendering of Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego, folded eastward because the cartographer ran out of space at the edge of the chart. More damaging still are Piri Reis's own words. In the annotations he wrote directly onto the map, he described the Southern Territory as hot, uninhabitable, and populated by large snakes. That description is incompatible with Antarctica in any configuration, but it fits tropical or subtropical South America with straightforward accuracy. Piri Reis was describing what his source maps told him, and what they told him was consistent with the known southern reaches of a continent that European navigators were only beginning to explore. The Terra Australis tradition adds further context. From Aristotle onward, classical and subsequent European geographical theory assumed that a large southern continent must exist to counterbalance the known landmasses of the northern hemisphere. This hypothetical southern land appeared on maps for centuries before anyone had physically seen Antarctica. Not because mapmakers had secret ancient knowledge, but because the theoretical requirement for it was embedded in the cosmological assumptions they inherited. Piri Reis, compiling from Greek-derived source maps among others, would have encountered this tradition directly. The southern landmass on his chart may be nothing more than a conventional placeholder, the Terra Australis of classical theory, rendered as a coastline by force of habit and the demands of a balanced world. The Orontius Phineus map of 1531 and the Boachie map of 1739 show similar southern continents, and Hapgood interpreted both as further evidence of the same ancient cartographic tradition. The mainstream interpretation of both is the same: the Terra Australis convention, not preserved ancient knowledge. So the Piri Reis map is probably not evidence of a lost civilization. The conventional explanation is well reasoned and supported by the source's own words. It should be the default position. But there is one thread the conventional account does not fully resolve. Piri Reis drew from approximately 20 source maps, most of which no longer exist. The chain of transmission, from whatever original sources those maps derived from, through successive copying across centuries or millennia, to the charts Piri Reis held in 1513, is incompletely traced and in most cases untraceable. The question of whether any of those lost source maps contain genuinely ancient geographical knowledge accumulated through exploration that predated the Greek tradition cannot be answered with the evidence available. It is not a gap that proves anything, but it is a gap. Here is the thing about the flood myths, the underground cities, the maps, and every other thread we have followed through this video. They are all, in different ways, pointing at the same place: down, toward the coastlines of the world as they existed during the last ice age, when sea levels were 120 meters lower than they are today. Toward the continental shelves, the submerged margins of every landmass on Earth that were dry land for tens of thousands of years and are now covered by ocean. Toward the landscapes where, if any ice age civilization had existed, it would almost certainly have built. Every major civilization we know about chose the same environment. Sumer grew up between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, close to the Persian Gulf. Ancient Egypt developed along the Nile Delta, where river met sea. The Indus Valley civilization was built on a great river system with access to the Arabian Sea. The Yellow River cultures of early China, the Maya along the Caribbean and Pacific coasts. Every one of them chose the water's edge because water means trade, food, transport, and the meeting of cultures that generates the complexity that civilizations require. If there was a civilization before our own, it almost certainly made the same choice. And the land it chose is now under the sea. Between 15,000 and 7,000 years ago, as the ice sheets of the last glacial maximum melted and the released water flowed into the oceans, sea levels rose by approximately 120 meters worldwide. Kurt Lambeck at the Australian National University and his colleagues published the most precise quantitative reconstruction of this process, establishing the timeline with enough resolution to identify which specific regions were submerged and when. What that reconstruction shows, when you look at it, is the systematic drowning of exactly the kind of terrain where human settlements cluster. Broad, flat, coastal lowlands, river deltas, shallow sheltered bays, the edges of continental shelves where marine resources are richest. Doggerland is the most thoroughly studied example of what was lost. That vast plain connecting Britain to continental Europe, rich in rivers, lakes and game, temperate and productive, sustained human populations for thousands of years before the rising sea finally covered it. Fishing trawlers in the North Sea still occasionally bring up its remnants. Mammoth bones dredged from the seabed, antler harpoon points, worked flint tools that were made on dry land and now rest under 30 meters of cold grey water. A world exists down there, partially preserved in the sediment, still largely unexamined. Off the northwestern coast of India, in the Gulf of Khambat, sonar surveys conducted in 2001 by the Indian National Institute of Ocean Technology detected what appeared to be geometric structures on the seafloor at a depth of roughly 40 meters, regular forms, worked stone, a layout that some researchers interpreted as the remains of a submerged settlement. Biological material recovered from the site was submitted for carbon dating and returned results suggesting very great age, though the dates have been disputed and the interpretation of the structures remains deeply contested. Many geologists maintain the features are natural, the product of sedimentary and erosional processes rather than human construction. Near the Japanese island of Yonaguni, a formation of stepped angular stone discovered by divers in 1986 has been argued by Masaki Kimura at the University of the Ryukyus to represent the remains of a carved monument. Terraces, platforms, right angles carved from the bedrock in forms that he considers inconsistent with natural fracturing. Other geologists have examined the same features and concluded they are entirely natural, the result of the sandstone's structural properties and the way it fractures along existing plains under the influence of wave and current action. Neither site has been confirmed as evidence of ancient human construction. Both remain disputed, and both illustrate, in their disputed state, the central practical problem of this entire area of inquiry. Marine archaeology at meaningful depths is technically demanding, expensive, and slow. The toolkit required, multi-beam sonar, remotely operated vehicles, sub-bottom profilers capable of imaging sediment layers beneath the seafloor, exists and is improving rapidly. But the resources directed towards systematically surveying the world's submerged continental shelves for evidence of past human occupation are a fraction of what would be needed to do the job comprehensively. The submerged shelves of the world cover an area comparable to the combined landmass of North and South America. The fraction that has been archaeologically surveyed is negligible. We are looking for evidence of an Ice Age coastal world in a search area of tens of millions of square kilometers, with tools that are only now becoming adequate to the task, in waters where visibility is limited and excavation is orders of magnitude harder than on land. If the evidence exists, it is there, under the water, under the sediment, under 12,000 years of ocean. We have barely begun to look. Before we bring all of this together, there is one more piece of the framework that needs to be in place. Because everything we have discussed, the flood myths, the underground cities, the stones at Göbekli Tepe, the erosion on the Sphinx, depends on a question that Western scholarship has largely refused to take seriously until very recently. Can a story be true after 10,000 years of retelling? The default assumption, built into the foundations of how historians and archaeologists treat oral tradition, is that it cannot. The argument runs like this. Every time a story passes from one person to another, it changes. Details are added, others dropped. Meanings drift. Metaphors calcify into literal claims. Literal events dissolve into metaphor. Over generations, this process compounds until the story bears only a symbolic relationship to whatever event, if any, originally inspired it. This view treats oral tradition as unreliable on timescales beyond a few centuries at most. Interesting as cultural artifact, inadmissible as historical evidence. Patrick Nunn at the University of the Sunshine Coast and his colleague Nicholas Reed spent years examining whether this assumption is actually supported by evidence or whether it is simply an inherited prejudice of literate cultures toward pre-literate ones. Their investigation focused on a body of oral traditions that could be tested against an independent record. The traditions of Aboriginal Australians describing specific coastal flooding events, cross-referenced against the geological and sea level record of the post-glacial period. What they found fundamentally challenged the assumption. 21 Aboriginal traditions were analysed in detail. Each described a specific stretch of coastline where the sea had advanced, where land that had once been dry had been drowned by rising water. In each case, where the geological record was sufficiently detailed to test the claim, the oral account was accurate. The sea had advanced at those locations. The flooding had occurred. The coastlines the stories described existed as dry land and were submerged, at times consistent with the geological record of post-glacial sea level rise. Some of these traditions appear to preserve accurate geographical memory of events that occurred more than 10,000 years ago. Across more than 400 generations of transmission in a pre-literate culture, without writing or maps, through every kind of social disruption imaginable, the information survived. Intact. Specific. Geographically correct. The mechanism that made this possible was not casual storytelling. These traditions were maintained through formal ceremonial structures, ritualized recitation, initiated knowledge keepers bound by obligation to preserve the account accurately, cultural correction mechanisms that functioned to identify and reject drift and embellishment. This was not memory as we typically imagine it, fallible, personal, impressionistic. This was memory as institution, as technology, as a deliberately engineered information system designed to persist across generational timescales that we would not have thought possible. Here is what that means for everything we have discussed. The question about flood myths is no longer whether oral tradition can preserve memory across 10,000 years. It demonstrably can. The question becomes whether the structural convergence of over 200 geographically isolated flood traditions, the same warning, the same vessel, the same mountain, the same birds, the same aftermath, repeated across cultures on every inhabited continent, represents independent invention of the same narrative pattern or shared memory of a shared experience. Both are possible. The honest position is that the question remains open. What is no longer possible is dismissing the flood myths on the grounds that oral tradition is inherently unreliable over such timescales. That argument has been answered. The evidence from Australia alone has answered it. If the myths are memories, they are telling us something. They are telling us that at the end of the Ice Age, coastal communities around the world experienced something catastrophic, something involving water, something that ended the world they knew and required the survivors to build a new one. And they encoded that experience in the most durable format available to them and passed it down, and it reached us. Whether you call that mythology or testimony depends on how seriously you take what Nunn and Reid found. And what they found is serious. Let us now lay out what we actually know and what we do not. We know that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old and has been systematically destroying its own surface for the entirety of that time. We know that the ocean floor recycles completely on a timescale of 200 million years. We know that exposed continental surface from before 10 million years ago is rare, and that the further back in time you look, the more incomplete and fragmentary the record becomes. We know that in 2018, 2 mainstream scientists published a peer-reviewed paper demonstrating that our geological tools are not capable of ruling out a prior industrial civilization in most plausible scenarios, that the chemical signatures such a civilization would leave are in most cases indistinguishable from natural events we already have explanations for. We know that the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, 56 million years ago, produced a carbon isotope excursion that is functionally indistinguishable from the signature of large-scale fossil fuel combustion, and that while volcanism and methane hydrate release are the accepted explanations, the precise speed of the onset and the exact isotopic ratio remain subjects of active debate among geochemists. We know that approximately 12,800 years ago, something catastrophic happened. The climate reversed suddenly. 35 genera of large mammals went extinct across North America in a geological instant. The Clovis culture vanished. A boundary layer containing nanodiamonds, magnetic microspherules, elevated iridium, and shocked quartz appears at multiple sites across 3 continents, all at the same stratigraphic level. The debate about what caused this boundary layer has not been resolved, and a growing number of independent research groups have confirmed the markers. We know that Göbekli Tepe exists, was built by people who had no agriculture, and is 11,500 years old. We know that the knowledge required to build it, the geometric planning, the organizational coordination, the sustained quarrying and raising of 20-ton stones, does not appear from nowhere and cannot currently be traced to a prior tradition. We know that the Great Sphinx shows erosion profiles that a credentialed geologist with a doctorate from Yale examined in detail, documented with seismic survey data, and attributed to rainfall weathering. Weathering that the conventional dating cannot account for, and that no subsequent critic has definitively refuted. We know that between 15,000 and 7,000 years ago, sea levels rose by 120 meters, drowning every coastal landscape on Earth, exactly the landscapes where any Ice Age civilization would have built, and that the world's submerged continental shelves remain almost entirely unexamined by archaeologists. We know that over 200 culturally isolated societies, speaking different languages on different continents, tell structurally similar stories about a catastrophic inundation, a preserved remnant, and a new beginning, and that at least one body of such traditions has been demonstrated to preserve accurate geographical memory of real events more than 10,000 years old. Each of these facts has a conventional explanation. Most of those explanations are probably correct, but taken together, they form a pattern, a consistent picture of a world at the end of the last ice age that was more complex, more capable, and more catastrophically disrupted than the standard narrative allows. The Silurian hypothesis does not claim to explain that pattern. It does something more useful. It provides a formal scientific framework for understanding why our confidence in having the complete story is weaker than we assume, and why the anomalies that do not quite fit deserve to be treated as genuine scientific puzzles rather than inconveniences to be explained away. So where do we actually look, and are we yet capable of looking there? The primary target is the submerged continental shelf. The Doggerland model shows the way. The systematic integration of oil industry seismic data with targeted archaeological sampling produced a detailed reconstruction of a lost landscape in the North Sea, its river channels, its lake beds, its coastlines, the human traces preserved in its sediment. That methodology exists, it is proven, and it can be applied to every other submerged shelf in the world. The vast drowned plains of Southeast Asia, where the Sunda Shelf once connected landmasses that are now separated by hundreds of kilometers of ocean, the continental margins of the Americas, the submerged coasts of India and Australia and Africa and the Mediterranean. The technology required is improving and becoming more affordable. Multi-beam sonar can map the seafloor in 3 dimensions with a resolution that would have been unimaginable a generation ago. Sub-bottom profilers can see through the sediment layer and image the buried landscape beneath, the ancient river valleys, the old shorelines, the buried topography of a world that existed before the ocean claimed it. Remotely operated vehicles and autonomous underwater systems can investigate specific targets at depths far beyond what human divers can reach. What is lacking is not technology, it is priority. The systematic archaeological survey of the world's submerged continental shelves has not been funded at anything approaching the scale the question deserves. The area involved, approximately 25 million square kilometers of submerged terrain that was dry land during the last glacial maximum, is vast, and the resources directed toward examining it for evidence of past human occupation are negligible. There is also a second search that has not been conducted at all. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica preserve a record of atmospheric chemistry going back hundreds of thousands of years, layer by layer, in extraordinary detail. If a prior industrial civilization had burned significant quantities of fossil fuels, The isotopic signature of that combustion might appear in the polar ice record, not just in the marine sediment cores where it would be difficult to distinguish from natural events, but in the layered atmospheric archive of the ice sheets, where the signal might be more clearly separated from its geological context. Frank and Schmidt proposed this search explicitly in their 2018 paper. It has not been carried out. This is the paradox at the edge of the question. The research program that could begin to answer it is not beyond our capability. It is not technically impossible. It would require sustained funding, institutional commitment, and a willingness to treat the question as scientifically legitimate rather than as the concern of fringe enthusiasts. And that willingness has, so far, been largely absent, not because the question is unimportant, but because in science, as in most human endeavors, the questions that challenge the most fundamental assumptions are the ones most likely to be deferred. Now turn the question around. We have spent this entire video looking backward, searching for traces of what might have come before us, examining the limits of what the geological record can reveal about the deep past. But the geological record is not only a window into the past, it is also a record that is being written right now, in real time, by everything we are doing to this planet. Think about what we are leaving behind. 300 years of industrial activity have released approximately 580 petagrams of carbon into the atmosphere, a negative carbon isotope excursion that is already legible in the sedimentary record and will remain legible in attenuated form for millions of years. Every marine sediment core drilled anywhere on Earth already contains microplastics, synthetic polymer fragments that did not exist before the mid-20th century and have now penetrated every environment on the planet, including the deep ocean trenches and the bodies of creatures that live in them. Radioactive isotopes produced by nuclear weapons testing beginning in 1945 are embedded in the global sedimentary record, marking a precise and unambiguous timestamp that future geologists will be able to identify as clearly as we identify the iridium layer at the Chicxulub boundary. The extinction rate of species is now running at a level comparable to the great mass extinctions of the geological past, a disappearance horizon that will be visible in the fossil record as a sudden, globally synchronous collapse in biological diversity. All of this is our geological signature. The Anthropocene layer, thin, globally synchronous, chemically distinctive, is being laid down right now, and it will be readable in 50 million years by whatever intelligence exists to read it. Here is the irony that the Silurian hypothesis makes unavoidable. A prior civilization that developed sustainably, that found ways to generate energy and organize society without burning through the planet's carbon reserves or driving species to extinction at catastrophic rates, would leave almost no geological trace. It would be invisible to us. The cleaner and more careful it was, the less evidence it would leave. But a civilization that burned, consumed, and disrupted on a large enough scale would leave a thin, ambiguous chemical anomaly in the rock that future scientists might attribute, quite reasonably, to volcanism and move on. The only civilizations that geology can detect are the ones that failed in the same way we are currently failing. The better they were, the less we would know they existed. That thought should sit uncomfortably. Not because it proves anything about the past, it does not, but because of what it implies about the present. We are choosing, right now, whether to leave a legible record or an invisible one. And the more legible our record becomes, the more thoroughly we have damaged the conditions of our own existence. Luis Alvarez and his son Walter spent years in the 1970s arguing that the thin iridium layer at the boundary between the Cretaceous and Paleogene geological periods was the signature of an asteroid impact, the event that ended the non-avian dinosaurs. The scientific community resisted the idea for years. It seemed too dramatic, too simple, too convenient as an explanation for a mass extinction whose causes were already disputed. Then the crater was found, buried under the Gulf of Mexico at Chicxulub on the Yucatan Peninsula, and the argument was settled. The thin layer in the rock was telling the truth. It had been telling the truth all along. The scientists just needed to take it seriously enough to look for the crater. The geological record is full of thin layers. full of signals that have been attributed to the most parsimonious available explanation and filed away. The Silurian hypothesis does not say any of those layers contain a hidden civilization. It says we have never looked at them with that question in mind, and that our tools for distinguishing between the natural and the artificial at the relevant timescales are not fit for purpose. That is not a comfortable conclusion. It is not supposed to be. We do not know whether we are the first intelligence to have risen on this planet. We do not know whether the anomalies in the geological record, taken together, are pointing at something we have not yet found, or at nothing beyond the known limits of natural processes. We do not know what lies beneath the sea on the submerged shelves of the Ice Age world. We do not know whether the flood myths are memories or metaphors. We do not know whether the people who built Göbekli Tepe carried knowledge forward from something that came before, or developed it from nothing on a hilltop in southeastern Turkey in the aftermath of a climate catastrophe. What we know is that the question is real, that it was asked formally in a peer-reviewed scientific paper by two scientists with no interest in mythology or conspiracy, who concluded that our tools for answering it are weaker than our confidence implies. That the evidence we have examined in this video, geological, archaeological, climatological, mythological, is genuinely anomalous in ways that the conventional narrative has not fully resolved, and that the most important places to look have not yet been looked at. The planet is 4.5 billion years old. The record is incomplete. The gaps are not empty. They are full of time, and time is full of possibility. We may be the first. The weight of the evidence, such as it is, suggests we probably are. But probably is not certainly. And in the distance between those two words, there is a question worth taking seriously. A question that, if we are honest about what we do and do not know, has not yet been answered. Something walked this earth before us, or nothing did. We do not yet have the tools or the will to know which.